So it's finally time to talk about premise, which is one of the most misunderstood and one of the biggest mistakes that guys make in game. All right, now this idea of premise basically means you're deciding and you're showing what this conversation is about. Is this a friend-to-friend conversation? Is this a man-to-woman conversation? Is this a business interaction? And what this really comes down to is an idea that you may never have heard of before. It's an idea called phatic communication, P-H-A-T-I-C, phatic communication. The idea here is it's the communication that tells you the nature of the interaction. So for example, things like a strong handshake says this is a business-like interaction. Things like a boardroom full of people in suits say this is a business-like interaction. Things like putting a sales contract in front of someone says this is a sales interaction. Those kind of things. The context, the setting, the way that the tone of voice used, the greetings used. Right? If you read a letter and it says, "Dear someone, someone, someone," that's very different than if the letter says, "To whom it may concern," or salutations, right? All those different things are phatic communication. And there's phatic communication in person as well, right? The way that you look someone in the eye is a phatic communication. The way you shake someone's hand, is it businesslike, or is it what I call like the man-to-woman handshake, where you're kind of like, kind of holding their hand like this, like almost as though you're leading them through dancing? That's a difference in nature, right? And the words you use. If you're using the word I, that's a very directing conversation one way. If you use the word you, talking about her, that's directing the conversation a different way. If you use the word we, or if you use you and I together as though it's a package deal, that's directing things in another very different way. So the idea here is there are all these different ways that you can establish premise. And the most obvious is you just come right out and state it, right? So the easiest way to establish premise would be like, "Hello, I'm hitting on you." Now that obviously has its problems in terms of the actual interaction, in terms of the value dynamics, in terms of subtlety, in terms of the user experience for the girl of dealing with you. So that's maybe not the best, but it is the easiest, right? The way that's the most certain of establishing the phatic communication is just to come flat out and say it. But oftentimes that's not the best because of that lack of subtlety, because of that communication of agenda, et cetera, et cetera. Then on the other hand, you can go way over to the other side of the spectrum where maybe it's like a slight little facial tick tells her slightly that it is man to woman, and then that's very, 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 very subtle, right? Or on a very, very subtle level, sort of disagreeing with someone can indicate that it's at least not a stranger to stranger communication, because you wouldn't bother disagreeing with a stranger. You'd just let it slide because they're not even worth disagreeing with, right? So there's this whole range from I'm going to flat out tell you what the conversation is to I'm going to communicate it in ways that are so subtle that they don't even necessarily communicate the whole message, but several of them together might communicate the message. And so the idea is that within this model of where you need to establish a premise, right? Open and then premise being the next step. You need to do enough to establish that premise. That's the prerequisite, right? So whatever you're doing, you must establish the premise. However, within that scope, if you can establish the premise more subtly, it's going to be better, right? It's going to be more of a situation that just happened, etc. But you absolutely must establish the premise, and you're doing it through that phatic communication, which is like communication about the interaction. Communication that sets the frame, sets the context for other communication. So I just want to put that idea out here, this idea that there's communication that is content, and there's communication that is the structure, the nature, the framing of what the content means, right? And that is the phatic communication. So when we talk about premise, what we're really talking about is establishing the proper phatic communication.